Good morning, everyone. Is the microphone working? I guess it is. Thank you very much for coming out on this excruciatingly cold morning to a very important topic, the open internet. Where do we go from here? My name is Mike Mandel. I'm the Chief Economic Strategist for the Progressive Policy Institute. For those of you who are not familiar with us, PPI has been in existence for almost 25 years at this point. We're a centrist think tank dedicated to pragmatic solutions to tough problems, dedicated to finding, sort of digging in to some of the issues that really bedevil the country and Washington and figuring out what can be done. One of our biggest areas is, in fact, technology and innovation. And in particular, we're concerned with the question about how tech growth can enable progressive values. That is to say, we believe that on net that technology is a plus, both for growth and also for diversity, for positive effects on the income distribution, for bringing up people of all sorts. And we have a lot of research that is connected with that, and you're sort of welcome to go to our website, progressivepolicy.org, to see some of it. These are very, very critical issues these days. Today we're going to be talking about the open internet. We have a fantastic panel that the moderator will introduce. But you know, let me just take this from the 50,000-foot level. We are in the middle of this massive technological transformation of the economy. An enormous amounts of investment are going on, and has the potential to really move the U.S. into a new era of high growth if we have the right institutional arrangements. And there's a big debate going on right now about what the right institutional arrangements are. This debate takes place on many different levels with many different types of arguments. And what we're going to have today is really a deep dive into one important set. But you should think about this as you listen to these arguments in terms of the broader economic and social impact. Where we want to end up with is, as the president said last night, greater growth, more middle-class jobs, and ladders of opportunity into the middle class. And these are the important items in the right order. Growth comes first, and then along with growth comes greater opportunity. And when we think about these issues today, we're going to be looking at them in a legal sense, we're going to be looking at them in an economic sense, but really what lies behind this is the idea, how do we get to the place that we know is there, where it is beneficial in the broadest sense? So let me introduce our moderator, who is sitting right to my left, and incidentally, I've stolen his microphone for the moment. I promise to give it back when I'm done. Brian Fung is a reporter on tech policy and technology at the Washington Post. He formerly was at the Atlantic and the National Journal. I've read his stuff. I think he's terrific. And we're so glad to have him here as the moderator for this panel. So please, a hand for Brian.
Thanks, Mike. Today we've got a pretty interesting lineup. By way of background, if you've been following this issue, you know that the D.C. Circuit Court overturned the FCC's net neutrality order and struck down its rules on non-discrimination and blocking. But the court also left open some room for the FCC to move forward on something like net neutrality with Section 706 of the Telecom Act. So today we're going to try and explore just what, how much room the FCC has to run on that, and what could possibly be coming next. To my left is Dr. Hal Singer of PPI. He is a senior fellow at PPI and principal at Economists, Inc., and he's an adjunct professor at the McDonough School of Business at Georgetown. He's the author of 2 books on the broadband industry, including most recently The Need for Speed, a new framework for telecommunications policy for the 21st century. To Hal's left is Chris Yu, the John Chestnut Professor of Law, Communication and Computer and Information Science, and the Director for the Center for Technology Innovation and Competition at the University of Pennsylvania Law School. He's the author of several books on communications, including most recently The Dynamic Internet, How Technology, Users, and Businesses Are Transforming the Network. To Chris's left is finally David Balto. David is the Policy Director of the Bureau of Competition of the Federal Trade Commission from 1998 to 2001. He's currently a public interest antitrust lawyer who is a prolific author, and he tells me he's the only licensed Zamboni driver in Washington, D.C. Who practices antitrust law. And given today's weather, that could come in handy. So without further ado, I think we're going to jump into our talk. And I think as far as the format goes, every panelist is going to start with a short opening statement. I think we're going to try and aim for 5 to 7 minutes. That'll be followed by a little discussion among us, and then after that we'll open it up to questions. So I think Chris volunteered to go first. So, Chris?
Well, thank you, Brian. And actually, one correction. I actually go by Christopher, not Chris, because my wife's name is Chris. And unless you want to be treated like telemarketers in my house, you're supposed to ask me. You're supposed to call and ask me for me by Christopher. Anyway, sort of interesting, fascinating developing happening in the last couple of weeks. We've had this wonderful lull where everyone was waiting what would happen next in the network neutrality dispute until the D.C. Circuit actually issued its decision, and finally it has. And so now we are here. Verizon versus FCC issued. The result, of course, is that the court upheld the transparency rule but struck down the discrimination and non-blocking rules. More interesting is the rationale on which they did so. They said that the FCC, the Section 706, is an affirmative grant of authority to the FCC, but that the FCC cannot exercise that grant in a way that constitutes common carriage. It concluded that non-discrimination and non-blocking were like common carriage and struck it down. I'd like to spend my remarks doing a couple things. One is I'd like to raise a real possibility that the D.C. Circuit misread Section 706. And that it may be that it ignored some basic principles of statutory interpretation. Setting that aside, I'd like to look into what cans of worms or potential cans of worms the opinion may open up, and we'll see how it goes, and we'll trace it through. So Section 706 is actually Section 706A and Section 706B. It says, the commission and each state commission with regulatory jurisdiction over telecommunications shall, and I'm paraphrasing a little, shall encourage the development of essentially broadband by utilizing price cap regulation, regulatory forbearance, measures that promote competition in local telecommunications markets, or 4, other regulatory methods that remove barriers to infrastructure investment. And to be clear, if you read the D.C. Circuit's opinion, they talk about other regulating methods. They say that over and over again. They're talking about the number 4, fourth of those prong is the jurisdiction that gets them there. Now, what's fascinating to me is, as a law professor, I actually, at a CLE in January, not just this year, but a year ago, organized by PLI, I was asked to give a grade to the arguments here, and I said I'd give them a C. Because there's a classic principle that we use in statutory interpretation on a catch-all. That's what that is. The last was other regulatory methods that promote infrastructure investment. And there's a familiar canon of statutory construction called ejusdem generis. Ejusdem generis says a catch-all is limited in scope by the terms that precede it. And if you look at the terms that precede it, they are price cap regulation and regulatory forbearance, both of which are basically deregulatory in focus. Measures that promote local competition in telecommunications markets, and regulating them more heavily is generally not thought to be an orthodox way to do that. And those terms are supposed to limit, in turn, what Section 706, the catch-all in 706A should mean. And if that's the case, I actually think if a court, this went up, in fact, linguistic canons are part of the Chevron Step 1 analysis, part of the textual analysis, and that, in fact, it's an interesting question of whether it would withstand scrutiny. The court also relied on 706B. 706B invokes the same terms as 706A, removing barriers to infrastructure competition and promoting competition in telecommunications markets. It's not clear to be materially different. More importantly, 706B only applies if the FCC determines that the markets are not being, that broadband is not being deployed in a reasonably timely manner. Up until the 706 order report immediately preceding the Open Internet order, the FCC had always determined that, in fact, it was being done in a timely manner. It changed course then. But what's fascinating is their benchmark right now is 4 megabytes down, 1 megabyte up. And if you look at with the advent of LTE, and once you include wireless providers in the space, 99% of American households as of the end of 2012 had access to 3 or more providers, according to the FCC's data. There's a whole bunch of issues we can talk about. It's census tract data and all this, but that's been problematic because if one household was served in the census tract, it'd be considered served. That's actually much less problematic in wireless as opposed to wireline, because if you're serving through LTE at one household, you can technically get a great deal of them. And in fact, what you'll see is, as of today, that is early 2014, Verizon finished its LTE build-out in the middle of last year. AT&T hit 85% in both. Sprint and T-Mobile hit about 2/3 of the nation at the end of the year. So whatever those numbers were at the end of 2012, they're actually quite obsolete. What's also interesting is, to me, is the more expansive part of this decision is, how can we say something, a regulation to promote competition in content and applications is designed to promote infrastructure investment? And to do this, in fact, the FCC said what's good for content and applications actually promotes infrastructure investment. In fact, it is like the tangential impact that a healthy market for content and applications will have on last mile. Well, this should remind you of a case that we all lawyers learn in con law, which is Wickard versus Filburn, which is the classic case of something that is purely intrastate having a tangential impact on interstate commerce and brings you in. In fact, there is a real possibility that the D.C. Circuit's interpretation of 706 will have the impact of Wickard v. Filburn, because then it opens the door for the FCC to justify regulating content and applications in the name of a 706A promotion of infrastructure investment. And in fact, what you could say is, oh, but they don't have jurisdiction over those actors. I remind everyone who's followed this long enough, we had the same problem in old broadcast television days. The FCC said we don't have jurisdiction over networks. But we do have jurisdiction over local broadcast stations, so we will regulate the contracts that networks can sign with local affiliates, and essentially fully regulate the broadcast networks in the process. Now that's sort of my interpretation of how 706 applies. What are the cans of worms? Well, there's one really interesting one that was avoided, which is if the FCC had no jurisdiction at all, jurisdiction would have fallen to the FTC or the states. If jurisdiction fell to the FTC, it would have changed jurisdiction in the House committees from Energy and Commerce to Judiciary. And for people who are involved in lobbying Capitol Hill and campaigned on it, that's vitally important. More importantly, what's interesting is Section 706A, as I said earlier, gives authority to the Commission and each state commission with regulatory jurisdiction over telecommunication services. What does that mean? If it gives jurisdiction to the FCC, it also gives jurisdiction to the state PUCs. And in fact, we know from those of us who lived through City versus Portland, AT&T versus City of Portland, they would love to get involved and itch to get in here. Now, they're subject to some limitations, the same limitations provided by 706A, but it's going to create, I would not be surprised to see state regulators starting to try to creep into this space. And that could cause a great deal of chaos and a great deal of non-uniformity and disharmony across the country. So what are the limits on the 706 authority? The two that the court pointed to: one, it has to be interstate or foreign communications. All of us know post-Wickard that doesn't mean anything. The second thing is it must encourage reasonable deployment of broadband in a timely manner. If they're saying anything like promoting content and applications competition, that's not a real limitation. The real limitations in it are it can't be common carriage, and it must be consistent with Selco partnerships, because that's where they upheld it. Selco partnerships made very clear you cannot, and actually the Verizon versus FCC made it clear, you cannot use 706 jurisdiction to mandate service to all comers indiscriminately on the same or standardized terms. And this is the language in the opinion that many people think is very, very hard to erect a non-discrimination mandate like this envisioned by the original Open Internet Order. The other thing that's really interesting is if you go back and read CELCO itself, it made very clear, even if you try to do the same thing through adjudication, one case at a time, that is not permissible. It is not the form of the rule that matters, whether it's ex ante or adjudication. It's whether you're applying it in a way that promotes a non-discriminatory access. All right, so they've asked me to address what does this mean for consumers. I actually think that the potential striking down the order has tremendous potential benefits for consumers. We're seeing a great innovation in business arrangements. One classic one is, the Amazon Kindle. The Amazon wants to pay the freight to deliver ebooks to your reader. And in fact, that wouldn't be permitted. Netflix Open Connect is a wonderful example. BT's PlusNet, they use DPI to actually prioritize gaming services, and they have the highest consumer satisfaction ratings in all of Britain. And lessons from the past, there's a Houston Law Review article. We shouldn't forget common carriage didn't even work that well back in the day. And there's an article I've written recently that goes through all that. There's an empirical literature that suggests that these sorts of access requirements don't work very well. If you look at an active experiment, I'm doing another project comparing what we're doing here to Europe. Europe investment levels are roughly half of what they are in the US, and basically they're adopting a form like this. And the history of unbundling least access and program access remains to be seen. So we'll see a change. We'll talk more about what the options are, whether it's 706, reclassification, congressional rewrite. My general mandate is if I were to give one piece of advice to Chairman Wheeler, the question is I was told that Janikowski was told, do you want to be known as the broadband plan chairman, or do you want to be known as the open internet chairman? And in fact, he thought he could do both, but the minute he handed down the open internet order, we all stopped talking about the national broadband plan. And so I actually think Chairman Wheeler faces a similar choice. I would encourage him to fold this discussion, not treat it as a standalone issue, but into the broader reconsideration of the IP transition. Otherwise, it could be the issue that swamps all of that, but it also broadens the debate in ways and the bargains that they can cut in ways that I think would be potentially very interesting.
Thanks. I think I have a tough assignment here. I want to bridge a gaping divide between those concerned about consumer protection on the internet and the fate of independent websites on the one hand, and those who want broadband providers to have the freedom to experiment with new arrangements with websites on the other. To bring the former, what I affectionately will refer to as the netizens, into my camp, I must prove that my solution will provide strong, consumer-oriented protections against innovation-stifling episodes of blocking, pay-for-access, or discrimination generally. To convince the latter, whom I affectionately refer to as the free marketeers, my solution must channel market forces to the greatest extent possible. And for the D.C. Circuit, which appears to share my sympathy with both sides of the net neutrality debate, my solution must preserve the incentive for websites to innovate while leaving, quote, substantial room for individualized bargaining and discrimination in terms, end quote, of special delivery arrangements. My solution, which Bob Hahn, Bob Lighton, and I have been peddling for years, involves the FCC making case-by-case decisions, or what I will call adjudications for short. Under adjudications, the FCC would permit special delivery arrangements between broadband providers and websites, but the agency would police abuses of that newfound discretion through a complaint process. And as I explained below, adjudication will ensure consumer protections on the internet, and it will bolster the incentive of both websites and broadband providers to invest at the edges and the core of the network, respectively, generating even more benefits for consumers. Fortunately, the two Bobs and I are no longer the sole defenders of adjudication. Since the D.C. Circuit's decision in Verizon v. FCC, adjudication has been endorsed by Professor Werbach in The Atlantic, Professor John Blevins in The Washington Post, and Professor Stuart Benjamin in his blog. Most importantly, the concept was floated by Chairman Wheeler in a post-Verizon speech in Silicon Valley. And as you will hear shortly, well, actually, Chris went in front of me. Christopher seems to disagree with their assessments that adjudications are feasible. under Section 706, and is certainly beyond my expertise to settle this dispute of legal interpretation. But from an economic perspective, it is abundantly clear that adjudications are the most efficient and most equitable solution available to the Commission. How would adjudications work in practice? A website could initiate a complaint of discrimination, including claims relating to blocking, degradation of service, or equity demands, against a broadband provider pursuant to a new non-discrimination rule. Upon a quick look at the merits, the FCC could refer the case to an administrative law judge. The complainant would bear the burden of proving certain things at trial, including but not limited to, 1, proof of discrimination vis-a-vis a similarly situated website, and 2, material injury flowing from the challenge conduct. Now, the similarly situated requirement is needed to overturn a presumption that any difference in treatment across two websites is driven for cost reasons or other efficiency rationales. And the material injury requirement would effectively shield small broadband providers from the rules. And importantly, this requirement should not be confused for a market power test. After all, it makes no sense to import antitrust standards verbatim if we are trying to protect against harms to innovation that are not readily cognizable under antitrust law. Adjudication would likely satisfy the D.C. Circuit's requirement that a lawful regime must leave, quote, I'm going to say it many times in the speech, substantial room for individualized bargaining and discrimination in terms, end quote. Else it would amount to common carriage in their view. Broadband providers would be free to enter into voluntary special delivery arrangements with websites. They could bargain to their heart's content, and they could even discriminate across websites in the terms of delivery for legitimate reasons, such as differences in cost or type of application. Now, why am I confident that this kind of non-discrimination would pass muster with the D.C. Circuit? In December 2012, the D.C. Circuit granted the FCC authority to impose data roaming obligations on wireless broadband providers using adjudication. In Selco v. FCC, which is cited repeatedly in Verizon, the appeals court explained why these interconnection obligations enforced via adjudication do not amount to common carriage. Now, it bears noting that the duty to interconnect, beginning with Hush-a-Phone and continuing up until the unbundling obligations in the Telecom Act, is part of the modern tradition of common carriage. Yet one wireless broadband provider can challenge the terms of interconnection offered by another for being unreasonable, according to the D.C. Circuit, despite the fact that wireless carriers are not classified as common carriers. Now, if the FCC were to embrace adjudication of the kind that I'm advocating in a revised open internet order, the D.C. Circuit would be hard-pressed to distinguish the two cases, particularly given, 1, both involve broadband providers, and 2, a duty to interconnect with a horizontal rival is arguably more interventionist than a duty not to discriminate for nefarious reasons against an input provider. And although they won't take their legal cues from an economist, Verizon would have to think hard about asking the D.C. Circuit to rule that non-discrimination achieved via adjudication amounted to common carriage, as the only remaining path for net neutrality at that point would be reclassification. Adjudication is vastly different from what the FCC's non-discrimination rule did that was just rejected by the D.C. Circuit. The FCC's now vacated rule made any arrangements between broadband providers and websites presumptively illegal and placed the burden on the broadband provider to overturn that presumption. The D.C. Circuit correctly recognized that the FCC's non-discrimination rule effectively barred special delivery arrangements unless they were offered for free, and thereby eliminated the potential for individual bargaining among internet service providers and websites. Now, some might question whether adjudications can work in practice. As it turns out, the FCC uses a similar process to adjudicate discrimination complaints in the video space, brought against largely the same set of providers. There, an independent cable network can challenge a vertically integrated cable operator for giving preference to its own network. And a handful of independent networks have availed themselves of this protection, including the NFL Network, Mass, and Tennis Channel. And in disclosure, I was the expert in all three of those cases. And pursuant to the NFL Comcast settlement, I'm required to say I'm feeling Comcastic at every public event. That was a joke. Under the program carriage rules, an independent cable network must show, among other things, that it is similarly situated to the affiliated network in product space, it is treated worse than the affiliated similarly situated network, and the inferior treatment has materially harmed its ability to compete effectively. Sound familiar? Due to differences in the types of carriage arrangements in the internet and video space, there likely would be a different evidentiary burden for websites. But the evidentiary burden in the video space is a good place to start when designing a non-discrimination regime for the internet. I'll finish with this point, and hopefully we'll get to talk about the consumer angle more. I'll finish with, in an age of budget consciousness, let me finish with this point instead. In addition to ensuring consumer protection, adjudication would encourage broadband deployment. Investment in the core and the edges of the network is interdependent, as correctly recognized by the DC Circuit. And a 2013 study by Mike Mandel of PPI found that nearly 750,000 Americans owe their jobs to the so-called app economy, which highlights the importance of getting these incentives just right. Permitting special delivery arrangements while policing potential abuses with adjudication could spur investment by developers of applications that depend on real-time delivery. And this investment at the edges of the network could in turn spur investment by broadband providers to support those real-time applications. And the heightened returns to owning a network from this new source of revenue could spur even greater broadband investment. I'll end there. Thanks.
Great. I just want everybody to know that when an economist talks about what the law should be, all lawyers, you break out in sweat and anxiety. I'm here as to offer much more of the consumer perspective. I think it's, when we talk about consumers and we talk about competition, it's important for us to go and separate, to try to figure out what we're really talking about. And I think when we do that, we should consider the differences between actual consumers and then also edge providers. It's, one of the things that's interesting to me is looking at the immediate response to the net neutrality decision, which had to be, one of the, if you look at just the press, had to be one of the most unpopular decisions, at least interpreted by, interpreted by the press. If you think about the public outcry that's occurred just because a mere 5 or 6 million people have lost their health insurance, imagine what's going to happen if ISPs and others really take advantage of the loss of net neutrality and all of a sudden start to come up with very significantly tiered systems. Consumers who are used to and really rely on getting everything, tremendous access to information at very low cost, all of a sudden being charged for different components, and being tiered in certain fashions, I think will lead to significant public outcry. I think you should have to start off with all the positive things in the FCC decision from a consumer's perspective. They did not paint them in a corner and tell them to shut down. Actually, they provided them the opportunity to reclassify under Title II. Now, that seems to be something reasonable that the courts seem to be somewhat sympathetic to. Politically, that might be an extraordinarily difficult thing to do. That's obviously the choice that the FCC had several years ago and decided not to because Title II opens up a Pandora's box of regulation. The Open Internet order was seen as a hard-fought compromise that kept broadband out of Title II. It's probably unlikely to get that battle, see them reinstate that battle. So what's the second best alternative? I think Hal has a very encouraging idea here about case-by-case adjudication, which would allow some flexibility for individual negotiations. So rather than declaring war by reclassifying ISPs as common carriers, let's come up with an approach that allows individual negotiations, but then allows egregious situations to be brought to the FCC's attention And then in turn, by the FTCC developing sort of the common law here, providing guidance to the industry about what's permissible and what's not. There are risks involved in such an approach. It's always ex post, so that means that there's harm that can occur. We're obviously going to have a changed environment in certain respects, and with the potential for consumer harm. On the other hand, rather than just speculating about what the potential benefits are, we'll actually have examples of that. Case-by-case adjudication, I think, does inform, will inform parties so that they can adjust their conduct to provide access without running afoul by running into some of the discrimination situations that have occurred before. For those people who would really applaud the fact that the regulation has been cut back by the elimination of the open internet rule, I want to caution. There's at least one antitrust lawyer in this audience at the podium right now, and you obviously have an erstwhile economist here who knows how to go and sue ISPs. By going and eliminating the open internet rule, the regulatory defense that ISPs and others would have, because there was the regulatory defense to private antitrust litigation is lost. The ability of firms to sort of say, we're being regulated, there's no role for an antitrust court, has just swum out to sea. And now actions by firms to discriminate would be subject to private antitrust litigation, which, though also slow, can result in significant treble damages and, of course, tremendous fees for erstwhile economists and hardworking lawyers. It's worth, there have been people who in the past have said, well, we really don't need FCC enforcement here, where the FTC could step in and bring cases against improper discrimination. Let me assure you, as the former FTC policy director, that would be a fool's errand. The FTC has no expertise whatsoever in discrimination areas, nothing like the expertise the FCC has. To go and rely on its sister agency would be foolish. By the way, I think Chris is wrong about the loss of political jurisdiction. The FTC is also, their supervisory committees are also the Energy and Commerce Committee, so there's no political element from shifting authority from the FCC to the FTC. It's important to recognize that conditions have changed dramatically since just 2010 when the rule was implemented. Edge providers are not the sort of timid, easily intimidated, coerced players that one might expect. You look at Netflix's comment when the decision was issued, they don't seem to be losing any sleep about the loss of the open internet rule. In addition, the political dimensions of this, I think, will make people timid about going and engaging in discrimination that's too visible and may raise political concerns. So I think, again, it's important to go and distinguish between, the role of edge providers and consumers. And it's important to sort of step back on what really benefits consumers versus what really worries certain classes of edge providers. For example, even before this ruling, people were calling foul at AT&T's announcements of sponsored data plans. The claim was that this might conceivably violate net neutrality principles. However, it seems to me that such an arrangement is beneficial to consumers to be able to use more data without being able to pay more. It also leads to better allocation of resources. Sure, if you make enough inferences, you can imagine a world where this might hurt competition, but there seems to me that there's no guarantee that this will occur. Ultimately, consumers will do best where competition really can break out the most effectively. I saw not a great deal of evidence that the open internet order sort of diminished competition. It did seem to encourage competition. I think the FCC is going to search for an alternative here, and I think there's a lot of promise in case-by-case adjudication to go and try to continue to protect consumers. Thanks.
Thanks, everyone. That was fascinating. I think at this point we're going to try and pick apart some of the arguments that were advanced today, and I guess I'd just love to start from the consumer's perspective. As someone who is really interested in this stuff at a personal level, has all sorts of gadgets, and you'll always find me on my iPad, no matter where I am. So to start, at what David was talking about discrimination and sponsored data, the idea that ISPs are going to avoid any kind of overt discrimination. I'd love to touch on that first, and kind of ask the panelists, what kind of tiered business models are we likely to see? Is it going to be more of the sponsored data, or is it going to be some of what net neutrality advocates are more worried about, which is more punitive stuff, saying we're going to slow down your traffic, we're going to if you don't pay up. Where do you guys stand on that?
Well, there's some interesting research by Catherine Tucker at MIT that says the ability to do sponsored data makes advertising 65% more effective than it would be without it. And so if you want a consumer impact, the reality is if you're less effective generating revenue from advertising, that means all the balance must be made up with direct charges to the consumer. And so this is one of the interesting problems that we have in this space, is that when we talk about benefits to consumers, it's not entirely, it's a complicated thing, which is increasing the effectiveness or the ability to charge prices to the content and application side has a direct impact on the amount that consumers pay. Now, what's interesting, just to go back on a couple things, to be clear, I'm not against adjudication. In fact, I'm on paper supporting adjudication on a case-by-case basis. The problem is the content of the adjudication is limited extremely by the Verizon versus FCC decision. So one of the things Hal said is, okay, discrimination based on classes of application would be okay with him. Now, first, I don't think that would make most network neutrality proponents very happy. That's very cold comfort to them, because that's entirely what they would like to do. I actually think it's a very reasonable thing to do, because if I'm an email user who's perfectly happy with a low bandwidth connection, it makes sense. Why should I pay more on a uniform basis for upgrading for video users? Why should I cross-subsidize what they're doing on a fairness basis? But here's the problem. Any regulation that's going to pass muster has to be less restrictive than common carriage. Common carriage already let you create different tiers of service for different kinds of customers. So if you follow the Verizon versus FCC logic, if all you're doing is what's permitted by common carriage, that itself is not a valid exercise of Section 706 power. And so if what we're saying, if you get in these arguments, is like, if we're going to create tiers of service, someone can say, well, if that's what you're trying to enforce, non-discrimination within tiers, that is common carriage. That falls outside the range of commercial, significant room for for individualized bargaining that Hal's talking about. And so the real problem for network neutrality proponents is the language of the Verizon FCC versus FCC decision says anything that creates tiers of service falls outside of Section 706 jurisdiction. And that's going to be an interesting problem for them to have. David talks about Title II reclassification. It does seem it's an option that people are considering. I do think that there's problems under the statute, which I'm happy to go into, but the bigger problem is the Supreme Court's decision in Brand X.
Hal, do you have any? What do you think about what Christopher was just saying?
Well, let me go back and answer the question. I think the question was, what kind of arrangements could we envision in today's world, or in an underworld that was more permissive? And the first, I'm going to start off in the wireline space, but the stuff that's I think most viable to me are applications that could take advantage of what I call real-time delivery options. Now, this isn't everyone's application. My blog certainly wouldn't be interested. I don't think the Washington Post would be interested. In fact, I think the vast majority of applications would kindly decline an offer of priority delivery at a surcharge. But I can envision certain applications. Let me give you an example. An online video game, a health service application that had to be delivered in real time, remote monitoring, for example, of a patient's lungs or heart. I think that I think that there are opportunities here for what we as economists would call Pareto improving deals. You have an application provider who voluntarily wants to buy something for better handling, and you have a service provider that wants to make this reasonable. And I think what was so offensive in the way that the FCC went about implementing net neutrality on the first round was that they basically made such arrangements impermissible. It was presumptively in violation of the non-discrimination rule. The method that I'm outlining would reverse the presumption. Presume instead that these are efficiency motivated, and police after the fact for things that have the look and smell of an arrangement that's being done for nefarious or anti-competitive reasons.
I just want to back up a bit because before we talk about the case-by-case adjudication, I want to ask about the actual decision, which seemed to be ambiguous in providing a path forward, whether it's reclassification or under Section 706. So it seemed that net neutrality advocates would say clearly the court decision was trying to guide the FCC toward reclassification. Others might say no, actually, it's trying to walk the FCC toward 706. Chairman Wheeler has said, he treats this as an open invitation and he intends to take it, but he leaves a lot of room as far as what he intends to do, even though he's hinted at the case-by-case approach. But so when you guys look at the court decision, what's your sense as to which direction the court is trying to nudge the FCC to go?
Well, I thought it was to move towards reclassification under Title II. That would seem to be the most intellectually straightforward way to do it. I mean, take on the political battle.
Well, it's interesting. The language in the opinion on blocking arguably invites the FCC to redo its rules under 706. It said there's more room here, but they've lumped the arguments in with the non-discrimination arguments. The non-discrimination arguments fail, so we'll treat them the same. That would arguably open the door for the FCC to reconsider the non-blocking part of it. The interesting, as far as Title II reclassification goes, I actually think that's ultimately, it's a hard argument to make because basically the definition to get within Title II is you have to transport communications between endpoints of the end user's choosing without change, modification, storage, or any form of processing. And the problem is in the current internet, it's not actually the end user that chooses the endpoints. If you ever go to, I was in Japan, I put in google.com, I ended up in a completely different place. If you go to Penn's website, we actually have two web addresses. In fact, the DNS works this way to decide which of those two addresses you go to, and all content distribution networks work in this way. There's 14,000 caches all over the world under Akamai. And so, in fact, to fall within that definition, you would have to fall within that statute. The last thing I'll say is the Supreme Court, the proposal to do Title II reclassification was built entirely on the dissent in Brand X. And when you have a legal position based on the losing side of a case, you're pushing the boulder uphill. Now, it's a Chevron deference. I mean, there's a lot of little things you can do to get around it. But to do reclassification under Title II, there are some statutory and some precedential boulders that you got to climb to get over it.
Al?
And just, I actually read the D.C. Circuit decision. Of course, I'm reading it as an economist, not as a lawyer, but I'm reading it as an invitation to pursue one of two options. One is reclassification. The second is this adjudication, something that looks closer to CELCO, something that, quote, permits or leaves room, substantial room for individualized bargaining and discrimination in terms. I think adjudications could satisfy that if it was adopted in the way that I outlined.
So, Hal, let me ask you, in your remarks, you talked about having a new non-discrimination rule as part of this process. What would that look like to you? And if you're having to design a new non-discrimination rule, how is that substantially different from where we are now?
Yeah, so let me answer the second one because that's easier. It's substantially different from what's in the Open Internet Order now. Now it says that any arrangements, and they were speaking about priority delivery in particular, but any arrangements between a website and a broadband provider would be presumptively in violation of the non-discrimination rule. and that it would be the burden of the broadband provider to reverse that presumption by proving just how wonderfully efficient the arrangement is. And I think that the broadband providers correctly interpreted that rule as a no-go. There's not going to be any such deals. I would actually flip the presumption around, and I would make the presumption that any arrangements, including arrangements that appear to be different across two different websites by the same provider, to be I'd presume that those differences are driven for efficiency reasons, for cost-based reasons, because you have a different type of application, and let the complaining party, the website, step forward and prove otherwise.
Chris, I wanted to ask you, Christopher.
Thank you.
Sorry. So your take is that Section 706 doesn't actually give the FCC isn't actually a viable route for the FCC. But so what's your alternative here? What's your
It's actually a very viable route for them for everything except non-discrimination. That's the hard part, which is, it's oddly enough, it can't look like common carriage. That's the point, the hard point we know. But if they wanted to do, just to make up, if they wanted to regulate privacy, if that doesn't resemble common carriage, it's possible that 706, they say, privacy creates a healthy content and applications world, and therefore that will promote infrastructure investment. The thing that Hal says that I keep getting hung up on, he keeps talking about similarly situated with respect to some criterion, is he dodged the hard question, which is how do we create a non-discrimination mandate in terms of reversing the burden of proof helps, but it doesn't change the substance. And so in the end, the inquiry someone's going to say is, look, they got this deal. I'm in the same position as them. I want the same deal. I don't have to pay more. That is common carriage. That's the problem that was created by the D.C. Circuit's opinion that actually didn't exist before. That's going to cause them big problems. The only other thing, a cautionary note I'd have about adjudication, I know Hal has litigated a bunch of these cases, and he's a friend of them. I don't know many people who think that the complaint system for carriage is working very well. And I know that they, by and large, have not been that successful. He won one case in the FCC in the NFL case, but then lost it. So there's settlements, and then there's ones that are overturned on appeal. Tennis channels are overturned on appeal. In general, when I talk to most people, they're not used very much, and they tend to be regarded as fairly cumbersome and not very effective, as was the unbundling and the program access rules. And so, it's you're forcing two unwilling, well, at least one unwilling party to do business with each other. And what we discover from unbundling is, even if they're going to comply with the law, expect them to do the minimum. My favorite story to tell about this in the old unbundling days, they said a CLEC came into the CO and said, I want to use your bathroom. And the incumbent said, there's nothing in the orders that says I have to use I have to let you use the bathroom. I have to let you do this and this. And they're saying, look, I'll comply with the law, but only just. And my reaction is, why should we expect an otherwise unwilling party to do anything except minimal compliance?
Thanks, Christopher. David, do you have anything to add on this point?
No, but I think it's worth observing. We've had this open access non-discrimination regime for 4 years, or much longer than that. There are reasons why the market works this way, and so this isn't something where you're all of a sudden forcing people to cooperate who haven't been willing to cooperate up until now.
Hal?
Just two things. The first is the fact that very few cases have been prosecuted under the program carriage rules, I think, is a good thing. I think it shows that the cable operators perceive the regime as having some teeth, and so they behave themselves. In a perfect world, we wouldn't have any adjudications. Everyone would be discriminating purely for efficiency reasons, and we'd go about our way. The second point I want to make is that you keep saying that anything that smacks of common carriage will be struck down. If you parse the words, they're really saying common carriage by itself isn't offensive. It's what they call per se common carriage, right? So think about, again, what they just permitted in December of 2012 in Celco. They're allowing one wireless broadband provider to fight about the terms of interconnection, which certainly smacks of common carriage, but yet that passed muster. So to summarize, I think that the D.C. Circuit would have a hard time if I could get Chairman Wheeler to embrace my variation of adjudication. I think the D.C. Circuit would have a very hard time to distinguish why the interconnection obligation for cellular providers is not common carriage, but non-discrimination enforced via adjudication for broadband data providers was common carriage. I'll leave it at that.
Well, if you go back and read the original rules, it gave a 16-part test for what was commercially unreasonable. And that went in many, many different directions in non-discrimination. And in fact, the order itself said you can charge different prices to different people. That's part of normal bargaining. And you can't, but the one that you cannot do is mandate service to all comers indiscriminately on the same or standardized terms. And so that's the big question is there room between that prohibition approved in the Selco decision under the orders and the ability to do a non-discrimination mandate? I think there's a lot of things you can do. Non-discrimination is tough because it's going to be a question, what is similarly situated and what those dimensions are, because that's going to be the heart of any complaint.
So I think at this point we're going to turn it over to questions. Just a reminder, if you're following along on Twitter, you can submit questions on the hashtag OpenInternet, which I'm following. And we'll start with actually a question from Twitter. Ben Sperry, who's a legal fellow at Tech Freedom, asks, would ex post case-by-case adjudication be permissible under Selco? How would it be different than what the FCC did in Comcast?
Can I say that, I'm sure Chris wants to weigh in, but I've read the D.C. Circuit's decision in Selco, and there is a complaint process by which complaining wireless broadband cellular providers can go after and challenge interconnection terms as being unreasonable. So I think that's the answer to the question.
Well, I'd agree. I mean, we don't want to talk past each other. There's no question after Selco an adjudication system can work. That's not the question. The question is, what will be the substantive terms applied in that adjudication, which are permissible and which aren't? Because Selco clearly upheld an adjudicatory system, and Verizon approved it. The question is, the terms that Selco approved it as not being common carriage and the care with which Verizon distinguished that case puts brackets around what you can do in that adjudication. But there's no question it can be done.
Yeah, in the back.
Thanks. This is a very, very interesting discussion, so I appreciate being here.
Sorry, could you speak up a little bit?
Yeah, I'm David Leduc with the Software Information Industry Association. So just to kind of bring this back to a practical discussion, this discussion about the adjudication model put forth by Hal, I think is very interesting. But I guess so the question I pose is, on behalf of digital content providers, I think the fear is just that under this type of adjudication system, it's a pay-to-play. I mean, you highlighted an example of where one entity wants to pay to have their stuff delivered in a timely manner. Well, then doesn't that open the door for a situation where everybody's got to pay to play, and then everybody's got to pay to play more, and then everybody that's providing digital content has to pay a lot, and they're competing, and then those with deep pockets can pay and provide their stuff, and those without it cannot. I mean, is that the model that you think is good, Hal? Is that what you're advocating? Because I'm just not clear on how that works, down the road in 10 years.
It's very fair, and there's two visions of the world as to how life is going to unfold in light of a more permissive regulatory approach. One is that the offer is going to be of the following: hey, we're going to leave you exactly as you are, no obligation to pay anything extra, but if you want something special, we're ready to do it at a positive price. That's one view of the world. I'd like to think that that's how it's going to unfold. Another view of the world is that the broadband providers are going to say, you know what, you're no longer going to get what you currently have for free. We're going to hold you up, and this is the price for admission. And I think that what you've laid out in your question is something closer to the second world. What I'm willing to take a bet on is that we're going to have something closer to the first, but we need a backstop. And the backstop that I'm putting forward is this complaint process. And so I think that's why it's the best of all possible worlds.
Well, I think that there are examples in the real world of people who willingly pay to play. One example I would give is a supermarket, which is if you have a new product, if they're going to put you on the shelf, they're taking a risk on you because they care about how much revenue they generate per square shelf inch, and the facing. And what's fascinating is a lot of people with new products can't get in because they can't prove that they're going to turn enough to justify that. So what they want to do is, I'll share that risk with you. I'll make you whole, take your risk on me, and it opens up a chance for them to get in. What's fascinating to me is also is, and I can give you other examples of that, that opens up wonderful opportunities for new business models where you can actually arrange things differently. The other thing you have to bear in mind is there is a risk premium that people take, sometimes investing in networks, but frankly, you talk about content and application providers, you have to think about them taking risks as well. So the two examples that immediately come to my mind, the iPhone has gotten a huge premium, but they reinvigorated a dead category by putting an enormous investment in it, when RIM and Palm were doing nothing. And the best example of this right now to me is Netflix, which went from on a roller coaster of whatever 13 billion down to $1 billion up to 16 billion by taking an enormous forward position in content, tens of billions of dollars by creating a valuable property. And what they're going to say is, having taken that risk with no guarantee it's going to pan out, they are now going with OpenConnect and going to network providers and saying, look, I used to pay you transit. I'm not paying that anymore because I've got a product that your customers want. And to me, that, just as the network provider is saying, we're investing in infrastructure, we need to get paid for that, and we need to finance the next generation of build-out, the content, the Netflix of the world have the same argument, and I would like this to happen in a free and open bargain and through a free market, as opposed to having a regulation that could end up adjudicating routine disputes over price, which would be the worst of all possible worlds.
Yep, in the back.
Yes, Rick Zimmerman, NCCA. I would just like Hal or others to build on Christopher's last point, which is the power of content providers. Because if we look at, for example, ESPN 360, you have a situation where customer of an ISP can't reach ESPN 360 unless the ISP has reached a deal with ESPN. Or if you look at the video space, you have a model where some channels pay to be carried, but many, many, many other channels are paid to be carried. ESPN, again, for one, retransmission consent, should be mentioned, granted different statutory regime, but content providers have power. So I think the number two scenario that was just described, when you look at the, the large content players, the search engines, others, probably as unlikely, but I'd like other folks to weigh in on that.
David, do you want to start? Do you have any thoughts on that?
Why don't you start with Hal?
Hal?
Certainly, the countervailing power is important, and it will mitigate against certain potential abuses. And we should feel some comfort in the fact that the content providers, at least the big ones who are attracting much of eyeballs, are not going to be slammed. But at the end of the day, Rick, I don't want to put out a proposal that relies purely on countervailing power as the backstop for consumer protection. I think there has to be something there, and hopefully, yeah. Well,
so do something about it.
I hear you, and I'm not. Unfortunately, I don't get to channel the future or God. I don't know how this is going to unfold, but I'm thinking that at least initially, this isn't going to be a huge market. I think that most application providers are just going to kindly decline the offer of special treatment.
What's fascinating is actually the number of application providers who need this is vanishingly small. People talk about real-time content. It's not even real-time content. What we found out is from the Beijing Olympics, we can actually flash that out through CDNs because as long as it's pre-recorded, you're okay. It's interactive content. And not even all games, because a lot of games, they program each console to hold the entire game in its head, and you only send the changes. So it's like video. There's a very, very narrow range of things that really are stuck in this way. And we can use storage and all these other things. But Rick, you actually make my supermarket point in a better context, which is cable channels, is the people who like to pay to play are often new channels. Because if you cut off the option to pay to play, there's no way they're getting on the air to begin with to prove their business model. And until they've got on some exposure on the air, they'll say, look, I'll pay for the first round just to show you I've got a good product. If we take that off the table, all of a sudden they're going to have a hard time saying, oh, they're going to have to do it. It's going to be a sales job and that's it. And that's a really tough to do because all these cable guys get I've got a new channel every day, and it becomes very, very hard to do.
Do we have a question over on this side? 1 second.
Hold on 1 second.
1 second, please.
Mike's coming over to you.
Hi, I'm Ed Verlick. I'm a fellow at PPI. I'd probably be more given to making a speech than, and One of them might be about the quality of reporting in the Post, which described the court decision as allowing internet connections to go to the highest bidder, which was a remarkable turn of phrase in no way related to what happened in the court. I think there is consensus here, to the extent that there's any consensus, about the model of adjudication. I think it expands on something that Hal's been saying for a very long time, which is that we should presume no harm and allow harm to be demonstrated. And certainly the broadband sector and markets have evolved to that point. I would imagine the following. What was
Sorry, do you have a question?
Yes. I warned you about this, Brian.
He's upset about that Washington Post.
Well, it did stick in my craw a bit, although that was an institutional, not personal remark. The court has given Wheeler a great asset, and that is some ambiguity. He can argue for reclassification, which reminds me of the season of Dallas that turned out to be a dream, that 18 years of court decisions were really a dream that somebody had in the shower or something like that. Does Wheeler have the ability, legally, institutionally, practically, to sit down with the major ISPs and to work out a code of conduct about what tiered service would look like, about the notion of horizontal equity, about equal treatment of equals in principle, and to use that as a predicate for adjudication down the road?
I think the answer is certainly yes. The threat of overhanging, the ambiguity, always leaves room for accommodate industry self-regulation, which has been the standard operating procedure for the FCC for a very, very long time. And I think, my sense is that most of the industry, both the network providers, service providers, are kind of ready to get off this issue. I mean, it's been around for about a decade now, and they have more important things to do. And so I think to find a reasonable accommodation which we could work, which is likely to work out anyway, is actually a very, very good solution that could be brokered by the FCC without a regulatory imposition.
Any other questions from the audience? Yeah, in the front.
Michael Nelson, Technology Policy Analyst at Microsoft. Yesterday at the State of the Net conference, we had another panel on net neutrality, and one of the issues that was raised was whether the open invitation to use 706 could lead to new regulations further up the stack. Now, we kind of care about that because we have something called Skype. Do any of you see the potential for either this FCC or some future FCC starting to apply some regulation of some type to provide app neutrality or some other type of neutrality higher up the stack on applications like Skype?
So
I think that would be a misguided approach, and it would really be stretching the decision, and it would. You'd end up with a very significant backlash to take the. Yes, but I think it would be an unwise approach that would, sort of lead to greater scrutiny of the FCC and scaling back of some of their, potential authority, and so.
But as you read the decision,
I think that would be a very liberal reading of the decision. That would be misguided.
I think it's possible. When you see what's happening with, especially if you do Title II reclassification, one of the things that Microsoft understands very clearly is the French regulator has actually made it very clear it's going to regulate Skype as a conventional telecommunications provider. And in fact actually has referred Microsoft's refusal to register to the prosecutor for criminal prosecution. And so, this is a real danger. The second issue is, that's under Title II. Under Section 706, the FCC actually, in the Open Internet Order, entertained an argument by Google that the Open Internet Order should exempt the upper layers of the stack. The FCC rejected that argument, saying market power can exist anywhere, and that they reserve the right to regulate any part of it. And I would think post Verizon versus FCC, the 706 authority opens the door wider to regulating other parts of the stack than was before the decision.
I think I'm going to jump in here real quick with a question from Twitter on the back of this this last question. It's Baron Soka asks how worried you guys are about broad 706 authority even beyond net neutrality as an issue. Is that a possibility that 706 could be used for things other than regulating the internet?
I mean, it's a possibility, but I actually think that this is some noise that's being drummed up to try to distract from the issue at hand. I actually think that we shouldn't allow it to distract us from the problem that we're trying to solve.
I actually think the concern is real because it goes under Chevron deference. The only real limit here is it can't be common carriage. So if it's not that, I think it causes enormous problems for non-discrimination, but I do think it leaves a great deal open. Now, there's a bunch of jurisdictional limits even within things like 706. So there's something they call ancillary jurisdiction. The FCC can't regulate copyright. The FCC can't regulate devices. I mean, there's certain hard points out there from the previous jurisprudence that may limit their ability to act. But absent some of those things, could they start to change the privacy contracts that broadband access providers have with upstream providers in the name of creating a healthy ecosystem that will promote infrastructure? That argument was certainly open. There's no common carriage block and would be subject to Chevron deference on review. And so in my answer, the question is whether they should is a different question. Whether they have the power to do so, I think Verizon opens the door wider than was before the day before the decision came down.
Anyone else want to offer thoughts on that question? Yeah.
I guess I'm concerned that people are working with an old model here. The idea that the internet is a stupid pipe doesn't quite work if we have all these caching services embedded in the network. The idea that this is about connecting a smartphone and a laptop to each other isn't right if we're talking about each of us having 50 or 100 little devices in the Internet of Things. I mean, there's a whole new world developing out there, and it's not the one that a lot of the net neutrality advocates base their decisions around. And I guess I'm concerned, as Christopher is, that we're going to see this extension, because in order to get things right at the network layer, they're going to have to do things the caching layer or at some other layer. I'm particularly concerned about what this decision and what we decide here in the U.S. will do overseas.
We have another question over here.
To give a very good example of what Michael's talking about, cell phones today discriminate on basis of application. If you are in a low bandwidth spot, they will give you your voice and hold you your email. And for me as a consumer, that's a good thing. Because if I only have a limited amount of bandwidth and I'm using both, I want voice. Now that's openly discriminating on the basis of application. And in fact, even in LTE phones now, we actually reserve bandwidth. It doesn't do voice over IP networks. It actually has a dedicated network which is still used for voice because we haven't made voice over LTE work yet. And the interesting question is as we see heterogeneous devices in the wireless world, transmission mechanisms, we're going to end up doing some very, very creative solutions to solve some very difficult technical problems that are actually good for consumers in the end. And to me, heterogeneity is good because people want different things and they're using different ways to get it, and the solutions shouldn't all fit a very narrow vision of how to do it.
Let's take a question from here in the blue sweater.
Fernando.
Hi, Fernando LaGuardia with Time Warner Cable. I wanted to follow up on an earlier point that Christopher made and tie it to what Ev suggested. Christopher, you said something about folding this into the IP transition. Can you expand on what you meant by that? And did you mean something along the lines of what Ev was suggesting in terms of some sort of more of a social contract, voluntary code, self-regulation, or what? What was it that you were referring to?
Well, it depends. There's a couple ways I can answer this. One is sort of the cynical analyst of Washington politics answer, which is if you want to do Title II reclassification, the best friends of the network neutrality proponents are the disability rights advocates, because they've traditionally used Title II to impose emergency response, disability, all these different requirements. And if anything, that's the camel's nose for bringing in broader sets of requirements onto IP-based transactions. And part of it also, my sense is that, I always think, if you broaden out the terms of the bargain, I keep thinking about how we moved intellectual property from WIPO into GATT. So we then traded off protection of IP for greater access to agricultural markets. You can actually broaden the terms of a trade-off the more pieces that are on the table. The second thing is it allows that it would, on a slightly more optimistic, less cynical note, it would allow us to deal more holistically with the environment without being focused by a narrow set of issues, because all these things affect each other. And it would open up, instead of saying, how do we do this under existing law, I suspect under the IP transition, it could be that they end up saying we need more authority, a legislative fix, but a more broader-ranging discussion that avoids the trap of just thinking about things in the old way. Here's how we did it before. How do we adapt a 1934 statute where the words are falling by accident on the internet just because they happen to be written in a way for a different context, and to think about it in a more bottom-up manner and a more clean slate manner that'll probably yield a better solution.
Let's try and get a couple more questions in here while we still got some time. Are there anyone? Yep.
Just to follow up on that question, Christopher, if you've read Kevin Warbach's paper on end of the PSDN, he suggests specifically using 214, and I just wanted to get your thoughts on the 214 approach, whether it's valid, not valid, useful, etc.
So Section 214, for those who aren't telecom lawyers, is the provision of common carriage, and this would come along with it, and there's a whole bunch of state taxation, a whole bunch of consequences that go with it, that says before you leave a market or enter or leave a market, you've got to get permission from the FCC. And in fact, and as long as you're there, you have to carry everybody. And we use this to impose what we're called carrier of last resort obligations, which are, I live in Philadelphia, Verizon is our carrier of last resort because they're the old incumbent from there. Now the problem is that that made sense when you had one big player who could be the backstop for everybody in a competitive world. In a world where the vast majority of my students don't actually have landline connections and for phones, and are increasingly giving up for broadband. And for those of us who are worried about the digital divide, we're discovering that in fact wireless broadband only users tend to skew towards low income and minority. We're going to be in a world where, in fact, we're going to ask, who's the carrier of last resort for these people? And we're not, in the wireless world, we're not going to see some big carrier there. Now, I actually think Section 214 is the wrong way. I think the better solution is, we used to do this with 911 call centers. We've now put that up as a competitive business, and people contract with them. We don't rely on one carrier to do that. There's something called call databases that verify every phone number you do. We used to rely on the incumbent for that. Now it's done as an independent business. And I could see different obligations which were built into the common carriage regime, largely enforced through 214, could yield a very different arrangement where that's someone else's business model to provide those types of services. And I can see that we see this with reverse auctions for universal service and all these other different aspects to it. I think that instead of sticking to the old world and saying, oh, you are the incumbent or you're in, we won't let you out until we found, and you have to keep paying for these other services that were built on a business world that no longer exists, I think the better thing is to think more creatively, as we have in other places where we open that up to a more competitive environment.
So I'm going to jump in here with a question of my own. Later this week, the comment period for a House effort to rewrite the Communications Act is going to drop. Looking beyond sort of the immediate future, how will sort of what happens here on net neutrality shift that legislative debate and then affect the way that the FCC functions on internet regulation moving forward?
I
take a stab. You want me to?
Go ahead.
I mean, I actually think that the resolution to the net neutrality fight could serve as a template for refocusing the agency's efforts as to what the real challenges are on a going forward basis. I think a lot of the regulatory apparatus is right now aimed at what I would consider to be horizontal problems, that is, horizontal problems of competition. And I think that while we don't have a perfect state of competition yet, we have enough competition that I think that we should refocus now on what I consider to be the vertical problems. And I see those as being the real fights on a going forward basis. You know, a Netflix, I can envision a fight that's coming down the pike between Netflix and a broadband provider, for example, who's trying to protect its own downloading services. I think that solving this problem to summarize, would go a long way to setting up a template, perhaps, to refocusing the FCC on what I think are the more important vertical issues of our time.
So if you ask your specific question, how will this affect the House process is not designed to do anything concrete in the short run anyway. We all know that nothing's passing this Congress in the election year. We've got till June. And every major rewrite of the Communications Act has taken 10 years. And so this is about starting. And so to me, introducing a one-off issue where the battle lines are already drawn, there's entrenched positions, would probably only hurt that debate as opposed to thinking more broadly about going forward. What's fascinating to me is I think Hal put his finger really on the dispute, I think, between him and me, which is I'm of the school in competition policy that most vertical problems are horizontal problems hiding in disguise. That, in fact, once you solve the horizontal problems, once we get enough, the vertical problems kind of go away. And so his idea that we solve the horizontal problems, we can now focus on the vertical problems, my reaction is the opposite. Once we solve the horizontal ones, we don't have to worry about the vertical ones because you can shift. And there's enough options available. Those are two very different schools of thought, probably beyond the scope of a panel like this to solve. But that is a fundamental issue that's in competition policy. It goes back a long, long way.
Can I just respond?
Let's let David give a stab at it first, and then we can come back to you, Hal.
Yeah, I don't agree with Chris that that there's a lack of horizontal problems here. It's just, I think from the everyday consumer's perspective, they've got limited options, and tomorrow when their ISP starts charging them for, some greater level of access, they're going to be rather dissatisfied, and switching is time consuming and difficult. I do agree with Hal that the vertical problems are really at the core here, and I think that's an area where legislative changes are taken in small steps, but that's certainly an issue to focus on.
Hal?
And Christopher's comment about vertical being horizontal in disguise reminds me of that saying that dancing is just the vertical form of, well, I'll leave it at that. I think that the problem is, given the economies of scale that are involved in building broadband networks, we're never going to have a situation where the power of the broadband providers is completely eviscerated. We have to tolerate, just as a fact of life, that we're not going to be served by 10, 20 broadband providers. You're going to have 3, 4, 5, and then you include the wireless, maybe 6, 7. There will always be some degree of power, and that's fine. It's nothing to blanch at. I don't think we're ever going to get it to a point where it extinguishes the impulse to engage on some occasions in discrimination in a nefarious way. And I'm not suggesting it's going to happen all the time. I just think that we need a backstop. And Fernando, to raise your, I think you were asking, would we be able to build a consensus around some kind of social compact that's just kind of hatched in a smoke-filled room, with the ISPs and Chairman Wheeler? I don't think that's going to be tolerated by the netizens. And I think we have to figure out some way to bring everybody, in my humble opinion, into the middle, into the tent, and reach some sort of policy consensus. And those have to be rules that are written down and are enforceable and have real teeth. So
what's interesting is I think, Hal, you're holding the world to too high a standard. And I want to quote Howard Shalansky. Howard Shalansky, for those of you who don't know, was chief economist of the FCC in a Democratic administration and is currently the head of OIRA, sort of the head regulator for the Obama administration. So this is a person who is not necessarily reflexively deregulatory or one of the free marketeers, as Hal so lovingly calls them. So his point is we should never forget that regulation is costly and imperfect. And so his point is we're comparing second-best outcomes. So when you're comparing regulated monopoly with unregulated monopoly, regulation is costly, but unregulated monopoly performs so badly, the balance clearly tips towards regulatory intervention. He said, though once you get to oligopoly, it's not that we've now achieved perfection, but the oligopolistic market performs significantly better. And that he thinks that once you get to 3 parties, the burden tips the other way. And it's not because we're saying that there isn't still abuse, isn't still some power. Yes, there is. But we're comparing second-best outcomes because just because those abuses are, the cure may be worse than the disease. And the empirical literature suggests that the vast majority of the benefit to consumers in terms of price comes from the entrance of the second and third operator, and then it goes down after that. And if you look at actual antitrust enforcement policy, you tend to see the enforcement authorities often approving 4 to 3 mergers, but rarely approve 3 to 2 mergers. And so there's a sort of a wisdom of crowds in this and how this goes. And my reaction is we shouldn't say, oh, there's still some potential exercise of market power. that's not the real question. The real question is compared to what, and then that's a much more difficult question where reasonable people who are inclined to intervene in many circumstances would say once you get to 3 players, we should get out.
David, you're scribbling some notes over there. Is there?
No, that's fine.
We've got just a few minutes left. We can take one more question. Yeah.
Just to bring in the international angle here, as you look around the world, is there anybody who's doing this better and has a more clear-cut approach to enabling an open internet?
Well, it depends on what you mean by better. I'm in the process of doing 2 major cross-country studies on the developed world, one in Europe, one in East Asia. They are very different strategies. The European approach is to unbundle everything, which creates openness. If a content provider wants to, they'll find service-based last-mile providers who can solve that. And what we find there is tremendous frustration in Europe that there are no content and application providers developing. They're wondering, where's the Facebook of Europe? The bigger problem is if you look at their baseline, which is they're shooting for 25, well, they call it 30, but they measure it at 25 megabyte per second service. Their coverage is half of ours, and their rural coverage is a quarter of ours. And so they're greatly concerned. Asia is doing, Pacific Rim, and not just Asia, but New Zealand and Australia are doing really, really interesting things. They've nationalized the internet and are building fiber to the home. And it is 2 times or more expensive than Fios was. And Verizon does not, let's say they're not expanding Fios. And they don't talk about it anymore. They used to talk about it a lot. And if you look at the numbers, you can do that. It's very expensive, and none of them have found a way to make money doing it. And so I think there's some limited things we can learn from other places, but I would say that most of those initiatives, government-led initiatives to build out broadband, have largely not paid out.
So obviously the issues here are very, very thorny. There's by no means any clarity here. But I think that there's going to be a lot more debate on this moving forward, and we'll all be looking very closely to see what the FCC is going to do. Thanks for everyone for coming. This has been a really enjoyable time. Hope to see you again soon.